Soka Gakkai is a 20th century lay movement based on an association with Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism. It now constitutes an independent organization. A good way of understanding Soka Gakkai is by looking at the three roots we can isolate that gave rise to it. For one thing, there was the phenomenon of new religions in Japan. Then there is the form of Buddhism known as Nichiren Shoshu. And there is the Society for the Creation of Values that was started by Tsunisaburo Makiguchi. We will look at each of these three roots in turn and explain how they contributed to the movement called Soka Gakkai. First, we listed the Japanese new religions as one of the roots. Of course, it would help if we would know exactly what we meant by new religion, and there are a lot of differences among scholars as to what exactly the term refers to. Some people say that in order to be a new religion, it has to have been founded after World War II, though this is a fairly arbitrary date. With respect to Japan, some people advocate dating the new religions as coming after 1868, and there is something to be said for that. But really, naming a particular date is not necessarily helpful in order to understand the very nature of the phenomenon. A better definition is conceptual. We will say that a religious movement that stands in an ambiguous relationship to its parent religion or other religions is a new religion. That is to say, if a new movement arises and either it wants to be seen as a particular subgroup of its parent religion but isn't getting the recognition or there is some strain for it, or if it wants to be seen as a religion in its own right and that's not happening, then I think there is a good reason to call it a new religion. In terms of Japan, 1868 is a good place to start because this is the beginning of the Meiji era, when Shinto, that is the traditional religion of Japan that worships the kami and sees the emperor as supreme, was the only officially permitted religion. So some people formulated new religions and gave them some kind of link to Shinto, and so they became permitted. But other religions, such as Buddhism, had a much harder time. Many of them superficially complied in some way. They disguised their nature or concealed themselves oftentimes. A famous example of a new religion that established itself during that time is Tenrikyo. Actually, it started a little bit before the Meiji era, but then it grew during that time. There was a woman named Miki Nakayama, and she claimed to be possessed by a kami, that is a Shinto god or spirit, Tenri Ono Mikoto, whom she called Oyagami, God the Parent. The religion then, Tenrikyo, started out as a faith healing cult with Miki very much in charge, but over time it has become a religion in its own right. The second route is the Buddhism that was started by Nichiren Daishonin, 1222 to 1282, which makes him roughly contemporary with St. Thomas Aquinas, though I doubt that they had any contact with each other. The dates also put him just a little bit later than Honen and make him contemporary with Shinran, who were the two main founders of the Pure Land schools in Japan. All three of these men came out of the school of Buddhism called Tendai, but had become disillusioned with it. The two biggest schools of Buddhism in Japan at the time were Tendai, which is very straightforward Mahayana Buddhism, though it had acquired some esoteric aspects by that time, and Shingon, which is a toned down version of Tibetan Buddhism that came by way of China to Japan. All three, Honen, Shinran, and Nichiren, spent some time in exile. A main difference between Nichiren and the other two is that Nichiren insisted that the Lotus Sutra was the supreme scripture, whereas Honen and Shinran, with their Pure Land theology, went in a totally different direction. Nichiren believed that the Lotus Sutra contained the purest form of Buddhism, even purer and clearer than that of the Tripitaka, the supposedly oldest scripture held by Theravada. But he thought that the Lotus Sutra went back to the Buddha Shakyamuni himself, and it, more than any other writing, expressed the true nature of Buddhism. During that time, Japan was under considerable stress for various reasons, one of the bigger ones being that it was very possible that the Mongols were about to send their fleet of ships with soldiers to Japan and take over. Nichiren Daishonin believed that this was a direct result of the fact that Buddhism had abandoned the Lotus Sutra by and large. So when he wrote in 1275 what I'm about to read, it was as much out of concern for the welfare of Japan as simply asserting that he was dogmatically correct. He wrote to the leaders of Japan when the Mongol fleet was closing in. The Nembutsu, which is the main chant of Pure Land Buddhism, leads to the hell of incessant suffering. The Zen school is the work of the heavenly devil. And Shingon, the true word school, is a great plague on this nation of ours. Some years later, he wrote a letter in which he reaffirmed that he had written those things with slightly different wording. He said, I insisted that the temples of the Nembutsu, Zen, and precept schools be burned down and the Nembutsu priests and the others be beheaded. Now, Ritsu is not the same as the Shingon school, which he leaves out in this sentence. Ritsu actually was one of the early 18 or so Hinayana schools in India, which later on pretty much died out except for Theravada, and Ritsu actually wound up finding a home, at least for a while, in Japan. And of course Tendai is not mentioned in any of these combinations because at least Tendai, even though he did not approve of it, recognized the Lotus Sutra. Nichiren taught his followers to chant a salutation to the Lotus Sutra. This is the Daimoku. Namyu Horen Gekyo. He wrote it on pieces of rice paper. The paper is called the Gahanzen. So keep this in mind because it's easily confused. The chant itself, Namyo Horen Gekyo, is the Daimoku. The paper on which it is written, which is called the object of worship, is the Gahanzen. The Daimoku is to be chanted regularly and for lengthy periods of time. By this we mean hours every day.
Namyo Renge Kyo, 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 Namyo Renge Kyo.
When Nichiren died, as is so often the case in Buddhism, his followers split into separate schools depending on how they interpreted what the master had said. Two of the main ones were Nichiren Shu, the school of Nichiren, and Nichiren Shoshu, the true school of Nichiren. Nichiren Shoshu is the one that is of most interest to us. All these schools of Nichiren Buddhism functioned like other Buddhist schools insofar as they had a priesthood and they worshipped the Gahanzen, and they also had statues of the Buddha, and as you can see in these pictures, little altars. This is in contrast to Soka Gakkai, where the Gahanzen winds up being the only object of worship. And thus we come to the third root of Soka Gakkai, namely Tsunesaburo Makiguchi, who actually founded the organization which became known as Soka Gakkai, the Society for the Creation of Values. Makiguchi was a teacher, an educator, who stood in opposition to what he perceived to be the Japanese educational system at the time. He saw it as creating basically mindless robots who would memorize a lot of information and then simply do as they were told by authorities. Makiguchi believed that education was not very effective and certainly would not contribute to the growth of a culture if we did not teach boys and girls how to recognize and implement values and to think for themselves. His movement took a step forward when he discovered Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism and became an adherent of it, and it is at that point that he actually founded the Soka Gakkai, and he gained a small number of followers. However, the political situation in Japan was getting more and more uptight, and it came to a point where each educator needed to sign a document that he acknowledged the emperor as God. Makiguchi refused to do so. He went into prison and he died there. One of his compatriots in starting the movement, and then also along with him in prison, was Josei Toda. And after World War II, when all the restrictions were lifted, he became the first actual president of Soka Gakkai. Toda was known for a very aggressive form of evangelism called shakubuku. When he died, Daisaku Ikeda became president. Now, he has had a long history with Soka Gakkai. He created the international version of Soka Gakkai, SGI, Soka Gakkai International. And at first, he saw the movement as strictly working with the Nichiren Shoshu priesthood. He saw it as simply an adjunct of Nichiren Shoshu as a whole. And as the movement grew, and it grew by the millions, there was a lot of money that went to Nichiren Shoshu by way of Soka Gakkai. Now, there was a time when he had to remove himself from the leadership. In fact, he was in virtual exile because there were some misunderstandings with the priesthood, but he continued to support the priesthood and eventually came back as president. Then, when it was time for him to retire, someone else took over his office, but he was named honorary president and still holds that title as of the time of this recording, and he is really the person in charge. Daisaku Ikeda is a celebrity in his own right, and he has met with many prominent people. For example, Arnold Toynbee, and together they produced this book in which they recorded a lengthy dialogue that they had. The central practice of Soka Gakkai remains exactly what Nichiren Daishonin taught his followers to do, namely to chant the Daimoku, which is inscribed on the Gahanzen, Namyo Horen Gekkyo. Now, doing so brings about certain spiritual benefits, such as ascending the 10 stages of existence towards Buddhahood. In other forms of Buddhism, these 10 stages are oftentimes pictured as different realms occupied by different kinds of beings. But in Nichiren, these are seen as 10 ways in which a person can either grow spiritually or revert to something that is downright subhuman. The lowest level is, appropriately enough, called hell. Just a little step up is anger, and it is followed by animality. Now, these are clearly subhuman qualities, but unfortunately, people sometimes act demonically or like animals. Hunger is a more human attribute, and we can equate it with desire. If all of our wants and needs are met, we may attain a certain level of tranquility. But this is not the goal for which we are looking. In fact, we may get to a point of feeling rapture, but we still don't want to stay there. Rapture is temporary, it's an emotion, it does not ultimately affect who you are. So you must engage in learning. You must come to understand what the universe and yourself and the Lotus Sutra and the Buddha are about. And you must chant consistently. Then you may come to a point of realization. Everything starts to come together for you intellectually. When you incorporate what you know into yourself, then you have become a bodhisattva, and you're only one step removed from the final goal. And that is being a Buddha. People report that oftentimes after 10, 15 years or so of regularly chanting the Daimoku, they have attained the stage of Buddhahood. And even if you should revert shortly before your death to a lower stage, which is always possible, at the point when you die, you will die as a Buddha. Now, when we say attaining Buddhahood, we're not talking about becoming an ethereal being who eventually disappears into nirvana. This is not the case for Nichiren Shoshu. The point of Buddhahood is to assist other beings to attain Buddhahood as well. So, a true Buddha will re-involve himself in the world and go on and help others to attain the same stage. This is the teaching of the Lotus Sutra as well. Now, there are also this worldly benefits to chanting the Daimoku. One is encouraged, if one faces a personal issue, to spend a lot of time chanting specifically with that issue in mind, such as if you need a new car or you're sick and so forth. And the official phrasing is that one ought to chant through personal issues. The way it is oftentimes put during recruiting, and that new members talk about it, is that one chants 4 things. One chants for a new car, or one chants in order to get healed from a disease. Now, this is supposed to be an immature understanding of what chanting the Daimoku does for you, but it is one that one hears very often, and it is one that is also sometimes used in the process of recruiting people for Soka Gakkai. Then they are supposed to learn that there is a more mature way of using the chant and changing yourself and the world around you. Another very important this-worldly benefit for chanting is to attain Kosen Rofu, or world peace. This is one of the main aims of all of Soka Gakkai, is that ultimately through politics, perhaps to a certain extent, but more than anything, through consistent chanting by millions of people, world peace will be attained. Peace would not have been the word to use for the events of the late 1980s and early 90s in the relationship between Nichiren Shoshu with the priesthood and Soka Gakkai under Daisaku Ikeda. The relationship had become extremely strained, and it became obvious that the alliance could not last. The split became official in 1991, though it took a little while to implement it. There were accusations of the lowest kinds that were thrown at each other, both from the official side and from the side of the followers. We don't need to get into all of that here. The internet is still filled with much of what was being said against each other. This was a very difficult divorce. The priests had a lot of power and privileges. They were in charge of the rites of passage, such as marriage. They were the only ones who could confer an official Gahanzen to any new full member of Soka Gakkai, and it had to be a Gahanzen whose design went back to Nichiren Daishonin and officially reproduced under their supervision. And they controlled the Taiseki-ji temple, which actually had been bought with money supplied by Soka Gakkai. So for a time, Soka Gakkai could not initiate anyone because there were no Gahanzens available from the priesthood. But the priesthood could no longer keep up the Taiseki-ji temple because the steady income from Soka Gakkai had been cut off. Eventually, both groups did what they needed to. The priesthood totally demolished the Taiseki-ji temple and reduced it to rubble. It was more of a liability than an asset anymore. Soka Gakkai found a Gahanzen that was presumably official, dating in its design from Nichiren Daishonin And so they used that for their initiations, and they're using that as their only official Gahansen at this point. From early on, Soka Gakkai became active in Japanese politics, and in 1955 they founded their own political party, the Komeito, which from 1964 on became a separate organization because the Japanese constitution requires the separation of religion and politics. The Komeito became quite effective. It became Japan's third largest party, and usually in a coalition with Japan Socialist Party, it had quite a bit of an effect, usually as the opposition party, but sometimes as the party that actually was in leadership together with the Japanese Socialist Party. In 1994, the Komeito split into the Komei and a new Komeito, and each formed their own alliances and their own coalitions. Then in 1998, both of those entities reunified and became the Komeito Party, again oftentimes referred to as the new Komeito Party, but the real name is simply Komeito. They also merged with a new Peace Party. Presently, they are in the role of loyal opposition. The current president of the Komeito is Yamaguchi Natsuha. Other Soka Gakkai activities include support of the arts. Particularly in Europe, there has been a lot of attraction to Soka Gakkai because a lot of artists felt that the atmosphere and the congeniality was geared to them. Soka Gakkai regularly sponsors art exhibitions. The number of adherents of Soka Gakkai is hard to determine because many people who think that by quick chanting they are going to get rich or attain some other easy benefit leave, and there are always new recruits. The number 20 million has been claimed, and what that number really says to us is that we can be fairly sure that there are no more than 20 million adherents. The other activity focuses on nuclear disarmament and global peace. As we said, this is one of the this worldly goals of Soka Gakkai, that the entire world will be at peace. And so they regularly hold rallies. The president publishes an annual letter to the world advocating universal peace. But let us not forget that when it comes right down to it, the way to achieve peace, according to Soka Gakkai, is through regular chanting.